one, go.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to our panel today on training for AI adoption in enterprises. My name is Emma Nelson, and today's panel is part of the 2022 OECD International Conference on AI in Work, Innovation, Productivity and Skills. It's hosted by the OECD and supported by the German Federal Ministry of Labour and Social Affairs. I'm delighted to say that this week we're being joined by more than 70 speakers and 3,500 registered participants from more than 100 countries. So thank you for listening today. Please feel free to place comments, material, questions into the chat during today's session. I will be looking at it and I'll be being passed questions because your questions are as vital as anything to try and further the debate when it comes to AI, because the purpose of this week is to broaden and deepen the debate on the impact AI has on work, innovation, productivities and skills, and just as importantly on the policies that we need to make AI trustworthy, effective and to benefit everyone. Well, let me briefly set some context before I introduce today's panelists. In the next hour, we'll be looking at the skills we need now and those we need in the future as artificial intelligence or AI become a key part of the modern workplace. AI can only be a success if we know the why, its purpose, its potential and its limits, but also the how. What skills do we need? What training is best suited to make sure AI can be adapted and rolled out for everybody? Because a successful company is built on the right individuals with the right level of skills developed over time. And the introduction of AI has both added to and challenged this situation. It allows training to be personalized, for example, and it allows short-term workers to gain the skills their long-term colleagues already have, but to do it really quickly. But to many people, AI itself is new. So how do we bring an entire workforce up to speed? We need to make sure that training that's introduced works for individuals and firms, but also that it fits with the needs of a wider economy. So what are the challenges faced by employers and workers, and what role can governments play in supporting people to get the right skills that will serve us not only now, but also into the future? We'll be talking about that for the next hour or so, but taking part in the discussion today, I'm delighted to say, joining us from Paris is Glenda Quintini, a senior economist at the OECD. She leads a team of economists looking at how skills needs are changing in the labour market and identifying effective policy responses, particularly in the area of adult learning and on-the-job training. Good afternoon. Good to have you with us, Glenda. Enrique David Espinoza is the team leader of the Toyota Motor Manufacturing Canada Innovation Library, where he runs projects that foster the adoption of innovation technology for manufacturing. A very warm welcome. I understand it's just gone 10:15 in the morning, so it's good to have you joining us from Ontario, Enrique. Arti Garg is Chief Strategist for the AI Strategy and Solutions Organisation at Hewlett-Packard Enterprise. As part of her role, she oversees Hewlett-Packard's advanced AI technology programs. Good morning to a very early California. I believe it's just gone 7:15 in the morning. Good to have you. Thank you for joining us and for being so bright and breezy. Let's move on to Matt Forshaw. He's Senior Advisor for Skills to the Alan Turing Institute here in London and a Senior Lecturer in Data Science at Newcastle University in the northeast of England. Hello. His work in data and AI skills includes working with the UK government on the skills pillar of the National Data Strategy and leadership of skills policy initiatives through the Data Skills Task Force. Good to have you with us, Matt. And finally, Mary Lyons is the Director of Enterprise, Employees and Skills at SOLAS, the further education and training authority based in Dublin and Ireland, where an increasingly important aspect of her work is promoting further education and training as a key resource for enterprise. Good to have you with us, Mary. Thank you for joining us. We'll be jumping into the discussion first. Please do have some questions ready for us. On the right-hand side, there is a chat function. We would like you, if you wouldn't mind, tell us who you are, what you do, why you're relevant to this, and then also your question. And I will do my best to place it to the right panelist. Please tell me who you want me to be posing the question to as well. Just one or the entire group if necessary. There's also a poll that would be very good for you to answer. It's just about to appear now, so we will be sorting that out. It's in the interaction tab. We'll be looking forward to your responses. I'm just about to put it up now. It's a question that's actually got 3 or 4 options to it. And it's about where skills and knowledge areas should be focusing. So the question is, what skills and knowledge area should training programs focus on in order to support the implementation of AI in the workplace? I'll read that again. What skills and knowledge areas should training programs focus on in order to support the implementation of AI in the workplace? You've got a couple options in front of you, and we'll be measuring who's choosing what. Firstly, advanced digital skills, programming skills, for example, on Python or other software that's needed to build and operate the AI algorithms. Basic digital skills, skills required to access information from AI algorithms on a laptop or other digital devices. Soft skills, teamwork, project management or communication skills required to foster the uptake and use of AI in the workplace. Or lastly, general awareness about AI, basic knowledge about the objectives and functioning of AI algorithms. So it covers a broad spectrum here. So please do let us know what you believe is the most important aspects here. Let's hear first from Glenda Quintini from the OECD, who will set the scene for us. Glenda, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Emma. At the OECD, we've done a lot of research on training in enterprises, looking into the extent to which enterprises provide training, who they train and what they train them in, why they provide training, and also how they make decisions about training. We've also mapped the policies that governments and social partners have developed to support the training in enterprises, from regulatory approaches to financial incentives, but also building capacity and capabilities for enterprises to invest in training. Our research so far has not been specifically on AI, although we look forward to doing more work over the next year. So what we've learned so far applies to technologies more generally. So we know, for example, that technology adoption in enterprises is really strictly related to the provision of training. For the vast majority of technologies, we know that they're not going to automate workers, but rather change tasks, be complementary to worker, or potentially also augment their capabilities, which means that workers will need to actually train to be able to work with these technologies. We also know that despite enterprises being the main provider of training for workers, they still face a range of challenges, which means that how much training they provide is often below what would be optimal for the economy. So for these different reasons, it's very important for government to intervene. They can increase the amount of training that's provided with increases in productivity and then competitiveness at the country level. And they can also address some of the inequalities in the provision of training. For example, we know that large firms train a lot more than small and medium enterprises. Small firms tend to be less aware of the benefits of training, but they are less aware also of the training needs related to the adoption of new technologies. And also firms and enterprises tend to train those who are already relatively high skilled, young people, workers on permanent contracts. So in a way, those who need the training the most tend to be excluded. This is partly because many firms feel and think about technology adoption, thinking about training in very specific skills. So for example, very specific knowledge of machine learning for the adoption of AI, and they are less aware of the need for training the whole workforce. So providing broad-based access to training for AI is very important to ensure that the benefits are widely shared. And to understand how we make sure that AI adoption will lead to more inclusive growth, we are, as I said before, launching a new project, a new research project under, again, the AI WIPS program, and with the support of the German government. And in this project, we want to answer some of the questions that I mentioned so far. So for example, do training programs need to target managers? Do they need to target the whole workforce? So what forms of training are most useful, for example, to help people gain the relevant skills? Do we need to focus exclusively on technical skills, or are soft skills also important? And of course, focusing on what governments can do and social partners can do to facilitate the rollout of training programs. So in a way, the discussion today is going to be a starting point for our research. So I'm very much looking forward to the answer to some of these questions during this session.
Thank you very much indeed, Glenda. Well, let's just dive straight into this session. And I'm going to come to you, Matt. In your role at the Alan Turing Institute, one of your jobs is to actually work out what kind of skills we need here just so that no one gets left behind, what are we talking about here in terms of what people need to be trained to do?
Absolutely. So I think when I think about data science and AI skills, the first thing I like to stress is the highly multidisciplinary nature. So we have, core disciplines around computer science and statistics, a strong need for that depth of application out into many other areas. And I think where we need to be looking at is effective working across those interfaces. So I think there are two dimensions here. There's the dimension of material itself, ranging from technical training, some of which extremely deep for people who are hands-on in developing the technology, also through to the sorts of support people need to be able to interface effectively with the teams providing technical delivery, for people to work in data adjacent roles, right through to the brilliant point Glenda made around making sure that organizations are empowered. Something we've certainly seen in the UK has been a disproportionate impact against SMEs in terms of executive education in data science and AI, and that's really one of those aspects that's hindering progress. We've got, in terms of delivery, a great range of graduate and postgraduate programs that are very suitable for people coming through study right now, but it's making sure that we focus as well on vocational training opportunities to make sure that people in the workforce also have that route to retrain. From I suppose a widening participation perspective, that's very important when we look at the UK labour market, where 80% of 2030's workforce have already left university and they're already out into jobs, and also 70% of the 1.5 million roles that are at risk of disappearing through automation, of which AI is a key example, are held by women. So I think making sure that those structured interventions in place are right. So I think when we look at these core disciplines, we're not going to find a single individual who can entirely encapsulate AI. It's around people working with confidence at that interface. I come from a computer science background who probably failed a few statistics programs at school, but I've learned to be more comfortable there. And equally, we have people more statistically focused, picking up the computing skills they need. I think the thing to recognize is there are cross-cutting concerns that we need to look at here around ethics, around responsible application of these technologies. And these are the sorts of skill sets that will be the same probably in 5 years' time, even if the technologies underpinning the systems have evolved.
Thanks for that, Matt. Let's try and place this directly into the real world of work by turning to you, Mary. Does what Matt has just described to you ring true? And where are you finding the greatest skills were needed? Not in the sort of like the broad base, but can you give us some examples of where we are lacking in terms of skills in AI? You come off mute, and we'll hear your wonderful words.
From our experience in Ireland, we've just completed a strategy in relation to artificial intelligence last year, and then we spent a number of months towards the end of the year looking at skills implications of that work. And what Matthew said there really resonates with me in terms of the need to focus broadly on a whole range of skill sets to enable artificial intelligence take up. We're lagging behind in Europe, and we have to ask why. So particularly in Ireland, there's a concentration of small and medium micro firms. So we're particularly interested in how we can diffuse technology adoption right across these smaller firms, which are stretched right across Ireland. So we very much take a sectoral as well and a regional focus in how we would encourage adoption. And in terms of the skill sets that are most urgent, I suppose, if we look at advanced manufacturing, for example, the middle tier level of work is really key in terms of, as Matthew said, upskilling and reskilling, because the tasks inherent in their jobs are changing rapidly, with the adoption of a whole set of new, I suppose, business processes for manufacturing. And it's really important that we focus not just on those actual workers, but on the management which strategically leads the company, and the team leaders and supervisors who coordinate the work at floor level in terms of operations. So we are very much looking at the holistic approach to skills development, and looking then how we can site some of that training regionally in centres of excellence, such that we're reaching out to the public in creating a channel of incoming recruits. There's a lot of labour scarcity issues at the moment, making sure that parents are aware, of the opportunities and that they have some understanding of artificial intelligence. As Matthew indicated there can be a degree of concern about the ethical implications and how artificial intelligence may be used, practically speaking. So we're trying to develop a cross-cutting approach such that we can regionalize concentrated hubs which will reach out to the public, reach out to smaller companies, demonstrate the use of the technologies, provide short and medium upskilling courses for all levels of work, particularly focusing on those at the middle levels and the shop floor and the technician levels, to ensure that they can work alongside technology and also their supervisors and managers so that they can create new workflows and that cross-disciplinary approach that Matthew spoke about. But also, most importantly, is that the decision makers in those companies can actually witness the use of the technologies, see the productivity gains that can be made, and really, I suppose, reassure themselves that if they invest in the upskilling and in the technology, that they will reap the benefits in terms of competition and maintaining their competitiveness.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Mary. Artie, let's bring you in, because so far both Matt and Mary have been talking about very AI-specific skills. People who work in that area. You have at Hewlett-Packard a wealth of people who are technically minded, who have very, very high level technical AI skills. What about the other skills, the soft skills that we talked about in the survey? The idea that this might not be something that you would automatically associate with AI, but how important to you are they?
Yeah, they're extremely important, actually, and perhaps because I come from such a technical background, those are the ones that I often sort of emphasize, and often will say that a data scientist is maybe 25% product manager and 25% sort of business executive, and needs to understand sort of what are the impacts of whatever AI tool solution that they are developing. There's a statistic I use that I often makes it into talks that I give. 85% of AI models that are developed never actually make it into production. Now, in some cases that may be because of the model itself doesn't necessarily give you the outputs that you are looking for, but I think more often is the case is that the focus on development was the model itself, as opposed to whether the model was trying to solve a problem that really was an acute problem that would further the organization's goal, whether it's a business or whether it's some other mission-driven organization. And also, I think equally important, and Mary alluded to this, is the processes that might need to change, the business processes that might need to change in order for that model to get into production. So one area that we've worked on with customers, with partners, is computer vision in manufacturing, being able to detect, say, defaults in manufacturing of products earlier using computer vision. And one of the things that I think might not always be appreciated when you're trying to use AI in something that seems fairly straightforward. I'm trying to use AI to identify defects in products coming off of a production line, is perhaps the pre-AI way of doing it was a human being looking at individual parts, and that human being probably has a much higher accuracy than a computer model would. And so how you react to detecting a defect might be quite different than if I'm using a computer model that can look at more products, but is slightly less accurate in terms of identifying an actual defect. So I think that's one area where a process needs to change, in addition to just having the skills to develop the model. And I'll very quickly say that that's where the soft skills really come in, is understanding that ecosystem and context in which the AI that you're developing gets deployed. And often, for some of us with very highly technical backgrounds, that may or may not be emphasized in our training. I came from a science background as opposed to a sort of math and computer science background. So I had to learn these things as a matter of necessity, not necessarily as a fundamental part of my work. So I already had to sort of bridge one discipline in order to get AI skills. But that's something that is very necessary, is being able to talk across disciplines, learn how to translate because even I'm a physicist, even a physicist and a chemist speak slightly different languages. And as you get further afield from your kind of core discipline, that becomes even more challenging. And it's a skill that needs to be taught, to have that kind of conversation with someone else that you're collaborating with.
Artie, thank you for that. Matthew, let's build on this a little bit, the idea of communication. There is that thing, isn't there, called the grammar test, that I know that colleagues at a university in Zurich don't let their PhD students actually qualify until they can explain what their PhD is about to the equivalent of someone who might be their grandma. I mean, these are big skills gaps, are they? I mean, how much does AI actually fill these gaps, and what are the other gaps that we need to be looking at?
Absolutely. So I think Artie's comments there really resonate with me in terms of that interface across business leaders and technical staff. I think we see big challenges in terms of empowering business leaders to be able to undertake governance responsibilities, identify opportunities and risks around the use of these technologies. But equally, and I love the statistic of the 80 to 85% struggling to go beyond proof of concept. That can partly be through technical reasons. So one of the barriers in terms of existing training is, well, what does it take to, what does it mean to take that model and operationalize it? How do you actually bring this to product, look at monitoring its performance and making sure it's continuing to deliver business value? It's incredibly difficult sometimes for universities and other providers to give that sort of insight. But then also, how can we encourage technical colleagues, people who will be these data scientists, to put forward an idea around an innovative use of data, but frame it in an organizational context? Let's not just be excited by the technology itself, but let's articulate the opportunities and those trade-offs in a way that will get that senior buy-in. So it's those two areas, I think.
Enrique, you're raising your hand to this.
Yes, thank you. I just want to add to what my colleagues already said, but let me just say that I've been a professor for many years, and now I'm in industry, so I've been in both sides of the aisle, I suppose. So from that experience, I can say that I'm going to talk more about the people who are considered like ordinary, very low or overly specialized skill sets, meaning the production workers in a standard manufacturing facility. The problem for them is that skills are applied in a very interdisciplinary environment, just like was already said. But the other problem that we can add to that is that many of them are overly specialized. They're experts in their field. And so many years of experience now work against change because they don't see much of a way to reinvent their skill set. And so I think training programs need to consider not just that the knowledge corpus, but also even the emotional sense of how it feels or what would it mean for them to change. Let me give an example really quickly. In terms of AI for machine vision, right? A university graduate would find it very easy nowadays to set up a camera, a deep learning environment, and get something out of it in terms of detecting parts. The question becomes, how does that become a really cost-beneficial setting or deployment for the company? The cost benefit that overlaps to business, even to accounting and other fields that these people may not be very much into. And so getting the training has to be cross-disciplinary. And if I do a little taxonomy that most people are aware of, cross-disciplinary can build into multidisciplinary, which can grow into interdisciplinary, which can grow into transdisciplinary. That's a long road, right? But I think starting with what's at hand right now, if you think of AI tools that are coming out of high tech, they are starting to be less and less about coding and more about programming, and even more so, more about understanding the data, manipulating the data, and interpreting and visualizing it. But in my experience, a lot of the high-tech people that come out of college, they keep talking about data as a generic instrument. They very few times talk about measurements for torque, or number of heartbeats in a patient, or the number of crops that got raised last year in a field. So the name of the data becomes kind of lost in the translation, and that skill, among many others that are considered soft skills, I think need to be put into place.
Enrique,
I can expand on that later.
Enrique, Artie, you put your hand up, but I just wanted to ask Enrique a little bit about what happened at Toyota in Canada. I mean, you've got what, 8,500 people working for you there. You introduced AI. What happened? I mean, how did you get it from the factory floor right up to the senior management?
Well, Toyota already has a very extensive training program that we call Toyota Business Process. You're probably aware of it. It's open domain. So for that, we use a number of tools that in which people go into training programs that are workshops, and they focus on resolving a problem, giving a current condition, a target condition, a gap, breakdown of the problem, what we call plan, do, check, act. And that's a very standardized process that it's getting traction also in terms of AI. So that's already in place. The perceived threat to manufacturing workers, of course, is that technology is going to come and replace them. Right? So what we're doing is trying to get people up to speed in terms of adopting new methods for early problem identification and to find, let's say, seemingly unrelated events. Also expanding their competence to explore causality. So machine learning operations that we call it, many people do in terms of management, is starting to hold everything together. And we still need to work on policies and best practices to put in place and foster that management allows large amounts of data that can be effectively shared across silos. So effort must come from all sides: engineering, administration, IT, production control, et cetera.
Artie, you want to say something to that?
Yeah, so I wanted to touch on or sort of expand on a couple of things that Enrique noted about what I would say, sometimes unfortunately referred to as maybe low skill or semi-skilled workers who have a lot of their training happened on the job. A lot of that, what they have is implicit knowledge about systems, about what's happening in an enterprise. Mm-hmm. And I think, unfortunately, right now, some of our highly technical training and education programs don't necessarily teach people how to value the knowledge that these workers have, which is often there are processes that are built around things that they've learned over time that were never written down anywhere. And so if you make a change, you may actually lose out on something that it's some process that is actually guarding against some other failure mechanism that you haven't learned yet. So I think it's actually very important to figure out how to facilitate these conversations. And I think that also starts to address some of the emotional concerns that a person may have, that AI or automation may lead to elimination of their job or somehow impact them negatively in the labor market. If I could tell just like one small story, because from my perspective, those are the people that actually understand the context and the systems the most. And so I've benefited the most from actually talking to the technicians, the production line workers in my career. When I was an undergraduate student, I'm from Detroit. I worked at an automaker as an intern. And one of the things we were required to do is actually build an engine, the first thing you're required to do when you start as an intern. And one of the technician who was teaching me how to build the engine, he had actually come up with a number of methods of measuring different parts of the engine itself and starting to understand things about what were happening on the production line. He asked me if I could actually help him automate some of the calculations that he was doing. So it's sort of my first data science project, if you will. But this was something where he had actually come up with a pretty sophisticated way of tracking these parts that were being produced off of at the time, it was sort of the prototype production line, but he didn't necessarily have the coding skills to automate his measurements. I didn't have his knowledge, but working together, we were able to produce something that I think is, quite useful for sort of understanding what was happening in those early stages of that production line.
Artie, many thanks for that. Mary, let me bring you in at this point, because we've just heard about Enrique talking about people's roles being made redundant. Artie telling a story of a task actually being made, automated before her eyes. How does training need to address this? How do you make it appropriate for people who are probably very worried that in 3 or 4 years' time, their role is no longer going to be needed because AI is going to do it for them? Mary, if I can just direct that question to you. I think she may have frozen. So let me, maybe we should bring in Glenda for this one. I mean, we have lost Mary. So I'm going to bring Glenda in for this one. The idea of, yes.
Mary's back.
Don't we love the internet? Is everybody back?
Very good timing there.
Carry on. Thank you. Mary's screen doing a little dance on our panel. Mary, let me ask you the question. We've just heard Enrique talking about people's roles being made redundant, Artie describing a case study of a role being made redundant before her eyes. How does training need to be made appropriate for this, for people who are likely to find themselves out of a job or their roles being redundant, at least in the next few years? Because your focus is often on sort of continued learning for further education and adult training.
Yes, so we've been working in Ireland to develop a whole approach to micro qualifications. We're calling them qualifications because even though they're very small, they're very much part of our national qualifications framework. So the same currency as any other qualification at any level or of any magnitude, even though they're only 50 hours of learning, and 25 of those may be blended or in person, and the other 25, is taken up with assignments and exercises and so on. So what we really focused on is making the learning very accessible in chunked form, in these micro formats, for people who are working, on production lines, who are less likely to avail of training, less likely to be released. And to make sure that the training is really flexible and really relevant, the co-design process with industry is really key. So we're working with the skills architecture in Ireland. We have regional skills forward tied into all the industry sectors. And we have, company representatives, enterprise agencies working with us in cooperative development groups to actually identify the needs. We go out to the companies, do surveys, just-in-time surveys with the particular sector in a particular region, and then get an agreement on what are the essentials so that we can design these micro formats very, very carefully. And then, as I said, co-design, we test them or pilot them on the ground then with the workers, to actually get feedback to make sure that they're really shaped appropriately. And also to overcome the confidence and the peer learning barrier, we do a lot of work on promotion, using all kinds of, digital means, local means, peer-to-peer testimonials, people who've actually gone through the training. We take video snippets and make those available as kind of calling cards to entice people to get involved. So they can identify with another worker, in another company that's done just what they're about to do. So really it's a whole mix of methods to overcome the confidence barrier, to overcome the accessibility barrier, to ensure the relevance, that it's actually designed at a point in time in specific response to identified needs. And then we create a number of different routes to access that training, so that if you're with an employer who isn't putting you forward, you can still access the training individually in your own right. For example, through, evenings or weekends. Or we have online learning available as well, particularly for basic digital skills. A key barrier to a lot of people on the production floor is they don't have basic digital skills. So, it's really key to give them confidence in using digital technology. And they can achieve this, in a blended format, or we have online, we have 36 courses available through an e-college service with the tutor support. It's different to usual online learning in that we do have tutor support offered. So we're really trying to ensure that we make this very structured, very accessible, very relevant, and that it leads to career progression. That's why we want to recognize qualification rather than a badge or a credential, so that they can build up, stack these small pieces of learning to actually achieve bigger awards and help them in terms of their job prospects.
Enrique, I'll bring you in a moment on this one, but Matt, in your experience at the Alan Turing Institute and in your advisory role when it comes to skills, what we've just heard from Mary there is a clear need that so many different areas need to come together to make this happen. This cannot just come from one organization. Can you explain to us how that could work in practice? I mean, there is an example, isn't there, about training NHS nurses. NHS nurses are busy enough here in the United Kingdom. How do you make sure that they're equipped to sort of take on AI as well?
Absolutely. And I think Mary's model's fantastic in that 50 hours of training, while far smaller than things like a master's degree, has the opportunity of being just so transformative in terms of someone's practice and someone's prospects. I think absolutely that confidence barrier. People very often don't see themselves as being beneficiaries of the training. People will have had negative experiences as far back as maths in school, other signals from their environment that tell them it's probably not for me. People may not have been in a higher education or training context for a very long time. And I think having that very strong grasp of what is day one competence in terms of these individuals, depending on the level of role and depending on the sector, that varies, but we need to right size what we're doing for that. And I think that co-creation as a mechanism of, I suppose, two-way knowledge exchange. I think what we learn from the applied context is the nuance of what it means to bring these to practice. The taught side can bring the academic rigor to it, but I think there's a lot that we can do there. I think the contextualization is key as well. We can take computer science graduates and statistics graduates and give them coding challenges or technical problems, and they'll be quite happy. But I think making sure that we lead off on training for other groups with a problem that can be solved and an efficiency in terms of their work the following week, the following month, is really important. And then the final thing I'll just highlight briefly is we've recognized this in the UK in a group called the Alliance for Data Science Professionals that's recognized that we need parity across sectors. The worst thing that could happen is if we're looking at chartership, degree accreditation, and those types of quality assurance activities, that every sector go off with different ideas of what the professional values are that must be upheld. So the Alliance exists as a coordinating function with the Turing Institute and around 6 or 7 professional bodies at the moment to agree shared standards that then percolate down to these sectors. So you can say the engineering data scientist has the same ethical principles and business acumen as the core computer scientist and people from other disciplines.
Enrique, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to go back a little bit to the emotional part of training. How do we get many more people than we do now encouraged or happy to go back and reinvent their skill set? One of the things the Innovation Lab does is that we run a once a year event called Innovation Showcase, where we produce a video out of the inventions that some of our production team members come up with, and sometimes get even a patent for. And that builds recognition. I have the experience that some of them become very happy. They get so encouraged by moving forward with more inventions. Some of them are so smart, but sometimes, like was said before by one of my colleagues, they don't feel like they know enough, which is many times not true. So recognition is one big part of it. If I take it back to the classroom, here at Toyota, we do have, like many companies do, we have a continuing education program that is available for all permanent team members to take college or university courses up to their skill, granted. However, with all due respect to academia, I think there's still a gap in how curriculum development policies and instructional design are still done. There's a breadth of experience already in instructional design methods, many of them which include AI, which was part of my PhD. But I still think that on the real life, current secondary school curriculum development policies are still instructional design and are still syllabus and outcome oriented. I think my belief as a researcher is that classrooms have to stop being controlled environments where learning resources are preset and in perfect working order. What I mean by that is that I ran an adult training AI/business program for many years back in the 2000s. And what happened in that program was that people came to a classroom and the programming environment was not set up correctly. The computer network was not set up correctly. And so they had to go and first, before starting to learn about Java programming, they had to fix the IT infrastructure. Many people did not understand the reason. They got upset and they go, why do I have to do this? This is not what I paid for. And I go, yes, you do, because when you go to the workplace, you're going to face this, right? Even before you start programming. So that flexibility is what I call making a course agile. So it's not that the classroom still has to be syllabus oriented, but workplace oriented. And we see that in many different places where they do that. It's not that it's not done, but I still feel that in government policy and in most of the academic world, we still are doing the old-fashioned way. So
Enrique,
yeah.
thank you for that. We will be going on to policy in just a moment, because I think this is
Sure.
where this is all leading, isn't it? But first of all, I'd like to bring the results of our poll. The question that we asked was, what skills and knowledge areas should training programs focus on in order to support the implementation of AI in the workplace? Well, we offered you 4 options: advanced digital skills, basic digital skills, soft skills, and general awareness about AI. And it seems that the majority of you think that soft skills and general awareness about AI are the really important things. It was 29.7% went for advanced digital skills, basic digital skills prioritized by 35% of you, but absolutely at the top, general awareness about AI, basic knowledge about the objectives and functioning of AI algorithms. That was the top choice of 42% of you. Artie, what does that say about where we're getting things right or wrong? We've been focusing so much on the technical skills for technical people working in technical jobs, but many people are concerned that actually we just need to be introduced to this world.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually a very interesting result, and I might have expected something slightly different. So that's a very interesting result, and I think that, I think that speaks to a couple of things. I think one thing that it does speak to is that I think too often, and when we talk about AI, it's talked about in a very abstract way or in a very futuristic way. We're going to have these fully automated kind of worlds where, and not kind of in the way that maybe AI is actually impacting people's lives today. And maybe as important, the way AI could actually enhance your experience as a worker today in your job. And so I think that's where maybe that breakdown is happening. And it really does go back to the AI practitioners needing to be able to sort of understand the context and speak the language of the people that are most affected by the solutions we're building today. And I think, I mean, where that goes in terms of what should we do about it, it's a challenging question to sort of speak to this audience from a policy perspective, because I think the governments that are represented in the OECD have very different approaches to how they set policy for government. But, one thing I'll just sort of step back and say is that what I think is important in any, and I used to work in government, is to sort of think about policy as sort of being as much as possible aligned with the way things already are. And so one thing I would encourage is to sort of think about things in ways that may not be obvious or straightforward ways of getting to the end result. And I'll use one example we have here at Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, where we focus a lot on our upskilling our supply chain. And our sustainability group in particular has been sort of providing tools and training to our supply chain to better understand how to use data to understand their sustainability impact. In that case, it's upskilling them on something they actually already care about, which is sustainability. And so that's a way to sort of not necessarily say we're doing something abstract AI, it's saying something very specific that people want to do, and then providing some tools and skills and training to enable people to sort of move in that direction of one of the things we talk about AI being able to enable in an enterprise. And so that's something where it's not necessarily the most straightforward path, but if you take larger enterprises and recognize they may have the ability to provide sort of incentives and skills to businesses that they interact with, that's another mechanism for sort of upskilling across the labor market.
Matthew, let me bring you into this one. We are going to get into policy now. I mean, what do we need our governments to do to make sure that the labour forces of today or tomorrow and years, decades to come are actually ready for this? And does it have to come from government? Because everything we've spoken about now has been from the private sector fending for itself.
That's really interesting. I think probably the largest priority for me in terms of government intervention is identifying the theme that we've talked around here around widening participation. So making sure that we can nurture this environment where the teams who are developing and providing governance of AI solutions are as representative of the populations that they impact. Back in 2018, the UK government provided 1,000 paid master's places through to individuals from historically underrepresented backgrounds into the field, which has been a massive success. And I think what's come from that is there were other supplementary interventions that have been very helpful, like career mentoring from data science leaders, many of whom sharing the same protected characteristics. And I think these are the sorts of interventions that can probably scale up quite readily. And it's about the empowerment piece, it's confidence building, developing communities of practice where if we have solo individuals in SMEs, in data science roles, there is a community where people can learn from one another outside of organizational silos.
How much, Glenda, I'm going to bring you into this one. I mean, how much are we going to find states who do embrace AI and who do embrace active training of people racing ahead of other nations? I mean, you need to look at somewhere like Singapore and China who are committed, or Singapore in particular, a place which is committed to long time adult learning to ensure that workforces are relevant, and then other countries which are still trying to work out what AI is and whether it is their job to actually support people through education here.
Well, yes, there are differences, but I think policymakers are waking up to the importance of training for the adoption of AI, the adoption of technology more general. You can see now, let's say, the policy discourse shifting towards, for example, empowering, exactly what Matthew was saying, empowering adults to train. Like, for example, in France, you have individual learning accounts, and now the European Commission, for example, is trying to support the introduction of individual learning accounts in other countries. And the objective of that is exactly to give individuals the power of choice, to try and show them how training is important. With individual learning accounts, for example, comes elements of career guidance, so you can access support to make your training decision. Again, this is not specific to AI, but it does address some of the issues we've raised here about empowering people, making them understand how important for them it is to train, that whatever change is coming is not necessarily coming to replace them, but they will need to continuously upskill, to remain relevant, to make sure they pick up new and emerging job opportunities. So I think it is actually, certainly the countries who are already doing it have an edge compared to others, but it is something that most countries are reflecting about.
Mary, let me come to you with a question from the audience. Thank you so much for sending your questions in. We do have time for more if you want to send some in, but let me begin with Ragda Zahran from Newcastle University. Mary, it's to you. In your view, when do we need to start integrating AI into the school curriculum, at the beginning of their studies or later? You are dealing with people who are already in the professional sphere. How much do we need to avoid playing catch up? You come off mute for us, we'll hear you.
This is a key question as part of our deliberations, in relation to the implications of the AI strategy for Ireland. We looked, at citizens, as well as, workers, as well as developers, innovators, and educators at all levels. And it was concluded that, more research is needed, for example, in terms of when to introduce various concepts, but also transversal skills introduction and integration of the curriculum was seen as important as the digitalization agenda. And I think for all citizens, the acceleration of digitalization and digital skills to overcome the digital divide, to make sure that people do have the understanding of the implications and applications of artificial intelligence and other broad-based technologies in their lives, is really key to creating a more positive attitude to the potential of technology. So I think this is a key work for government. But also, just in reference to the previous question, the Irish state is investing very significantly in technological skills development, awareness, transversal skills across all the levels of education. And in particular, in relation to upskilling, now the focus is on people at work and lifelong learning, as you were saying, Emma. So, states are aware, as Glenda was saying, they really understand the importance, but I think I would stress that the cultural context within countries and regions needs to be taken into account in terms of the policy measures that are utilised. And they have to be attuned to the culture, and ensure that they will be received positively and that they won't further alienate sections of society or, workers who have been left behind previously, in terms of other technological developments.
Enrique, let's bring you in on this one about the speed of all this. I think there was an article saying that coworker.org compiled a database of more than 550 workplace AI technology products that did everything from training to hiring to absolutely everything, placed in companies. 30% were created between 2020 and 2021. How on earth does the private sector and legislators and governments keep up with this when things are coming out at such a speed that we have barely time to pause for breath?
You're absolutely right. The way I see it as a researcher is that AI, just like any other area of computer science, has become commoditized. So it's a commodity now. So there's the good and the danger. The good part is that, well, we are creating technology at a very high speed, which is great. The danger is that we tend to overlook the impact it's going to have. I don't know too many people who stop and think, make a matrix out of KPIs or out of potential, the pros, the cons, the dangers, the threats of a technology with respect to the workplace. They see it as what honestly vendors and service providers say is the nice to have, and they don't compare it to the actual benefit it's going to bring to the workplace. So I think there's a little bit of a gap in the analysis that takes place. I understand that many companies don't have the manpower or the womanpower to do this, but I think it's a need. It's not just a nice to have. So it goes back to my initial, and I think everybody else's initial comment on how do we make this become cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and even transdisciplinary. It's a challenge, I agree. The way we do it at Toyota, again, is through TVP. TVP will have to undergo a little bit of a change moving forward in the next few years because, well, the times have changed, but it's very solid, and that's how we do it here at Toyota. Now, in terms of the number of products, really, I don't see any other way but to create a think tank inside the company and really have the critical mindset to distinguish between what's needed and what's a good to have and what is really just buzzwords. That's what I would think.
Artie, your take on that?
Sorry, trying to find the unmute question. So, I think that it is very much a question of trying to really understand how do you make this relevant to people as they kind of look into adoption. So, I just keep coming back to, and I think actually, Matthew, you might have alluded to this as well, is that adults are busy, they're working. So how do we make it so that this is something that they perceive value in their current job? And how do we talk about it in those contexts? I do think that often the providers of AI solutions might be sort of setting the tone for why something matters. But I also do see that that you have to sort of overcome some sort of barrier of this provides value to me. And I think we need to think about that in the training context as well, is that how do we make people feel that if I do this, one, it's worth it, and two, I will actually benefit, because there can also be a perception that, well, if I'm not really going to actually further my working life, my career by gaining these skills, why should I bother, because this is hard? And I think that's true for everyone. I always say I learned these skills because I had to, not because I really wanted to know what a neural network was. It was just it ended up being a requirement of my doing my research. And I think we need to think about that for everyone that's impacted by AI.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Artie. Let's conclude this session with a quick fire round. I'm going to be going around the room, if we could describe it thus. One piece of advice from you all, if you can limit it to, well, if you make it short and sweet, that would be wonderful, but we could still talk about it. The one piece of advice that you would give to a government which wants to increase AI and AI-related skills of its labour force, but is finding itself in the world we live in today. Who would like to go first? Enrique, let me seek your opinion first.
Okay, in short, I would say governments should continue and dig deeper into embracing diversity in the workforce. And I'm going to be very specific by that. I mean, bring more women and minorities into the AI workforce, which is a perceived challenge. Also develop agile training programs to allow training along with other key needs of people, such as childcare, caring for others, mobility, while concurrently continuing to grow in the workplace.
It's all about people.
That's in a nutshell what I would say.
All about people at the end of the day. I think you just demonstrated that absolutely fully. How about you, Matt?
Yeah, absolutely. I would echo all of that. And I would probably say to really pay close attention to the geographic disparities in play, and also the sectoral differences around data maturity, to recognize that the examples of fantastic practice that you're looking for do exist. Many of these mechanisms are ones that can be replicated if training providers, if organizations can be given the confidence and a bit of guidance to do so. So I think it's around raising awareness of excellent practice going on, and also looking at supporting the sector to be able to replicate those. That doesn't require huge amounts of funding, just the development of this community of practice and this knowledge sharing beyond existing networks, beyond existing relationships between training providers and employers.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Matt. Artie, what would your one piece of advice be to a government which is trying to navigate itself through AI and the workplace?
First, I would second what has already been said, but beyond that, I would add to it is just to think broadly about what it actually takes to make adoption and the use of AI successful. Two areas where I think it's important is sort of to think about that full context, and for the government that may include a regulatory context as well, and also to think about the full labor market that is impacted by AI, and really go back and focus on those that you may think are sort of either just need to be retrained. They may not need to be. They may actually have a lot to contribute to the discussion in terms of what makes AI adoption successful.
Thank you, Artie. Mary, your take, your one piece of advice to give to governments trying to get their head around AI, its arrival and its implementation in the workforce across its country.
Yes, I echo everything said there, particularly about the fact that we need to think about the regulatory context and ensure that those who are most impacted are involved in the decision making and in the awareness raising. But overall, I suppose what I think is one aspect that would make most difference would be to make AI real for people. You know, I do think you have to demonstrate it's not transparent. You know, many people do not work in contexts where they could see the application of it right now. It's quite invisible. So I think whether we're promoting it or whether training or whether, you know, actually educating people to be working in very high-tech areas of AI, I think it's really important for the whole citizenry to have the opportunity to see it at work. So I really think these hubs or centres of excellence where you can demonstrate and you can actually bring in the public, bring in the leaders, as I said, bring in the workers, and you have different services for all of them. They actually see it in practice and they can see it's actually quite useful. You know, taking your point, Archie, in terms of how do you show its relevance? And I think that could be really impactful, that people can see it for themselves. And that because a lot of people won't reach out to find out about it. So I think, and then the other thing is basic digital skills for everybody. I think that's a real enabler.
It's a tiny sentence, but an enormous ask for that. Thank you very much indeed for that, Mary. Finally, Glenda, your thoughts on what a government needs to know and needs to get ready for.
Yeah, well, in addition to all that's been said so far, I think governments could focus also on making it this all possible, which means that they need to put in place the instruments, the practicalities. So, for example, Mary was referring before to micro qualifications, right? To have micro qualifications, you also need to be able to recognize the skills of individuals. You need to be able to to know where the micro qualification fits into a qualification framework for the country, for example, so that you can certify, so that people can have small micro qualifications and ultimately get perhaps a higher level certificate. So all these elements of the adult learning ecosystem that need to be in place so that we can make all that everybody has said happen are very important. And this is really a role for governments to play.
Glenda, thank you very much indeed for that. Glenda Quintini, thank you. And my thanks to everybody on today's panel. Enrique David Espinoza, Matt Forshaw, Artie Garg and Mary Lyons. Thank you for diving in for the last hour, and thank you if wherever you are watching this and taking part, thank you for taking part in our poll. Thank you for sending in your questions. It's been a pleasure to host this seminar. We're going to have another session in a little while, in about 15 minutes time. It's going to be about enabling effective AI policies, launch of the OECD framework for classifying AI systems. Practical advice on the way. Make sure that you join us as well in the next few days for further discussion on the use of AI work, innovation, productivity and skills. Tomorrow, we will be talking about how to use AI to match workers with vacancies. So join me if you can. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, and to all my panel, thank you so much and goodbye.
Thank you.